Hi, everyone. My name is Hirsh Jain, Director of Market Intelligence at VERDANT Strategies, and today I want to talk to you about cannabis rescheduling, what just happened, what it actually means, and just as importantly, what it doesn't mean. Before diving in, let me briefly lay out where we're going today. Over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to cover 5 core questions. First, what the rescheduling process actually involves and how it works. Second, why this moment is historically significant and how it traces back to the medical cannabis movement that began in California decades ago. Third, what rescheduling means in practice for research, taxes, pricing, and operators' balance sheets. Fourth, how rescheduling may impact capital markets, banking, and the unresolved issue of uplisting onto major stock exchanges. And fifth and finally, what rescheduling means for federal legislation, state reform, and global cannabis policy. So with that roadmap in mind, let's start with what just happened. On December 18th, President Trump signed a historic executive order directing Attorney General Pam Bondi to complete the rulemaking process to move cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 under the Controlled Substances Act. If finalized, this would represent the most significant change to federal cannabis policy since the Controlled Substances Act was enacted under President Nixon in 1971. And it would mark for the first time the U.S. government formally acknowledging the medical efficacy of cannabis, something that is fundamentally incompatible with Schedule 1 status. But to be clear, rescheduling does not legalize cannabis at the federal level. Cannabis would remain a controlled substance under the Controlled Substances Act. And so, rescheduling to Schedule 3 would not dismantle the state-by-state market structure that defines the U.S. cannabis industry today. But before we get ahead of ourselves about what rescheduling means, it's important to be very clear about what the president can legally do and what he cannot legally do here. The president doesn't have the unilateral ability to reschedule cannabis, but the president does have the authority to direct the Attorney General to complete the rescheduling process and issue a final rule under the Controlled Substances Act. There's been some speculation that Attorney General Bondi could issue a final rule as early as January, but the exact timing remains uncertain there. What is clear, though, is that this process has been years in the making. It was initiated in October of 2022 under President Biden, and it rests on 3 critical pillars. First, a comprehensive scientific and medical review by the Department of Health and Human Services, which concluded that cannabis has accepted medical use. Second, an Office of Legal Counsel memo, which analyzes the Attorney General's legal authority and how the Controlled Substances Act scheduling factors should be applied to cannabis. Now, this memo matters because it effectively serves as the administration's internal constitutional and statutory justification for rescheduling. And third, a robust administrative record developed through evidentiary hearings before DEA Administrative Law Judge John Mulrooney. Now, let me just pause on that last point because it's really important. Judge Mulrooney's hearings are key here. They involved expert testimony, cross-examination, findings on medical use, safety, and abuse potential. This is exactly the kind of record that federal courts look for when deciding whether to defer to an agency's judgment on an issue like rescheduling. Now, legal challenges here are inevitable. Groups like SAM, or Smart Approaches to Marijuana, have already signaled their intent to legally challenge the rescheduling process, and litigation could delay implementation. That said, from a legal perspective, this rescheduling rests on unusually solid footing. Courts traditionally grant administrative agencies substantial deference when decisions are grounded in a strong administrative record, a detailed scientific review, and a clearly articulated legal rationale, which is what happened here. So, assuming that the rule survives legal challenges, rescheduling would become effective 30 days after its publication in the Federal Register. Now, let's just take a step back because, this moment didn't come out of nowhere. Rescheduling is deeply rooted in the medical cannabis movement, a movement born not in Washington, but at the local and at the state level, particularly in California, as a response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s. When the federal government failed to respond adequately to that crisis, patients, caregivers, and local governments stepped in. San Francisco's Measure P in 1991 was one of the first acknowledgments by a U.S. government body that cannabis could be used compassionately for medical purposes. California's Proposition 215 in 1996 followed, legalizing medical cannabis statewide and directly challenged federal prohibition. And then, something remarkable happened. Over the next 3 decades, state after state adopted medical cannabis laws. And today, 40 states have legalized medical cannabis. Over the course of those 3 decades, millions of patients used cannabis openly, doctors recommended it, courts tolerated it, and regulators adapted. Slowly but surely, the federal government lost the ability to credibly claim that cannabis had no accepted medical use. And so rescheduling is in many ways the culmination of that bottom-up democratic process, proof that small state-level experiments can ultimately force change at the federal level. Which brings us to why this moment is so historically significant. For more than 50 years, Schedule I had been the federal government's most stigmatizing designation. Removing cannabis from that category is an institutional admission that decades of policy were misaligned with evidence and with lived experience. What's also striking and easy to miss is how politically unusual this moment is. While the rescheduling process began under President Biden, it was President Trump who issued the executive order directing its completion. Many Democrats who rarely say anything positive about President Trump have openly applauded this move as a meaningful step forward. In today's deeply tribal political environment, that kind of bipartisan acknowledgement is exceptionally rare, and it gives rescheduling additional durability. The executive order also goes further than scheduling alone, directing federal agencies to expand engagement with CBD products and to explore Medicare coverage pathways in defined contexts, reinforcing the idea that cannabis policy is increasingly about healthcare access, not criminalization. Now, let's talk about research, because this is another area where rescheduling matters, but expectations need to be calibrated. Schedule I drugs are extraordinarily difficult to study. Moving cannabis to Schedule III lowers barriers, reduces administrative friction, and makes it meaningfully easier for universities, pharmaceutical companies, and federally authorized researchers to conduct clinical trials. Now, that is real progress, but it's not a panacea. Cannabis research will still face obstacles: DEA registration requirements, FDA oversight, sourcing limitations, and funding constraints. Rescheduling improves the research environment, but it does not instantly normalize cannabis within federal biomedical research. Let's now turn to what most operators are watching most closely: 280E. Once cannabis is no longer a Schedule I or II substance, IRS Code Section 280E, which has historically prevented cannabis companies from claiming federal tax deductions, should no longer apply. That alone would dramatically reduce the effective tax rate for cannabis companies and alter operator economics. Some companies that have been structurally unprofitable may suddenly become net income positive. But timing matters here. Whether relief applies retroactively to tax year 2025 or only prospectively in 2026 depends on IRS guidance and judicial interpretation. And the benefits shouldn't be overstated. Many operators have not been paying their 280E taxes for years, and so they carry massive uncertain tax positions, in some cases exceeding $500 million. So rescheduling is hugely positive, but a lot of balance sheet cleanup remains necessary for most companies. It's also important to understand where the 280E savings might go. A meaningful portion of 280E savings is likely to be passed along to consumers through lower prices. We saw this after California repealed its cultivation tax in 2022, which resulted in price compression, not significantly more profitable operators. But to be clear, prices going down helps legal operators compete more effectively with the illicit market, and so it strengthens legal market share. And that's a welcome development for all legal operators. Next, let's talk about capital markets. Rescheduling should help attract new investors to the sector, and so it could help lower the cost of capital for the industry. In addition, some banks may become more comfortable serving cannabis operators under Schedule III. But many banks, especially larger institutions, may still be wary of working with cannabis operators, with cannabis still being federally illegal. So banking challenges will likely remain under Schedule III. Perhaps the biggest unresolved issue is the potential for uplisting onto major stock exchanges. It is absurd that Canadian cannabis companies can access U.S. capital markets, the deepest and most efficient capital markets in the world, while U.S. operators operating in compliance with state laws cannot. This is fundamentally incompatible with President Trump's stated America First economic philosophy. Preventing U.S. companies from accessing U.S. markets while foreign competitors can do so undermines domestic investment, job creation, and competitiveness. The New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ will likely require explicit federal government guidance from the Attorney General, the President, or Congress to become comfortable listing U.S. cannabis companies. But if President Trump leans in on this issue and helps ensure the requisite guidance is provided, uplisting would be transformational for the cannabis sector. So fingers crossed. Rescheduling also improved prospects for legislation like the Safe Banking Act passing in 2026, which could both solve banking challenges in the industry and enable uplisting onto higher exchanges. But obstacles remain, especially House Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Majority Leader John Thune, both of whom are unfriendly to cannabis. An explicit endorsement of this legislation from President Trump might be necessary to pass the bill. At the state level, rescheduling may shift debates in states where Republicans hold substantial power, with President Trump's move providing some political cover for reform. A key state to watch is Pennsylvania, which has failed to pass an adult use law for several years due to Republican opposition, but will consider the issue again this year. The 10 remaining medical holdout states, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Wisconsin, and Wyoming, also all feature significant Republican control. Most of these 10 states will consider medical cannabis measures in 2026. They are also key states to watch this year to see how they are influenced by President Trump's move on rescheduling. In addition to helping bring new states online, rescheduling may also prompt more rational policies in states that have already legalized cannabis. For example, in California, punitively high taxes and strict municipal bans are premised on the idea of cannabis as a vice, a premise that becomes much harder to defend once cannabis is formally classified as medicine by the federal government. Finally, zooming out even further, the global implications of this moment are enormous. For much of the 20th century, the United States set the global agenda on drug policy and exported cannabis prohibition all around the world through treaties, diplomacy, and foreign aid. Now, that dynamic may reverse. As the U.S. formally acknowledges cannabis medical value, countries across Europe, Latin America, and beyond may find new political and regulatory space to reform their laws. U.S. rescheduling has the potential to catalyze a global expansion of medical cannabis, increase patient access worldwide, and trigger a broader international cannabis boom. So, to close, cannabis rescheduling, when it is finalized, should be understood as a structural reset, not a finish line. It would correct one of the most fundamental contradictions in federal cannabis policy, the idea that a substance used by millions of patients, recommended by doctors, and regulated by states could still be treated at the federal level as having no medical value at all. That contradiction may soon be formally acknowledged and abandoned by the U.S. government. But rescheduling would not magically resolve every challenge facing the industry. It would not end federal prohibition. It would not instantly unlock banking or uplisting or interstate commerce. It would not erase years of accumulated tax liabilities or repair balance sheets overnight. And it would soften, but not eliminate, the political obstacles that still exist in Congress and in many state legislatures. For operators, this is a moment that calls for measured optimism and strategic discipline. The companies that benefit most from rescheduling will not be the ones that assume everything is fixed overnight. They will be the ones that use this reset wisely to clean up balance sheets, invest in compliance, strengthen operations, retain talent, and position themselves for a more rational, competitive, and durable industry. And for policymakers, both here and abroad, this moment sends a clear signal. The United States is finally moving past a half-century-old framework that treated cannabis solely as a criminal problem and towards one that recognizes it as a matter of medicine, public health, and economic reality. In that sense, rescheduling is not the end of the story, but it is the opening of a new chapter, one in which better policy, better markets, and better outcomes are finally possible.